Welcome to my session today. My name is Dr. Hilary Duckett, and I'm a senior lecturer here at the Lincoln International Business School. I teach across lots of programs and really enjoy working with students to explore the really fascinating area of leadership, really. And there's lots you can do in the leadership field. Every time you pick up a newspaper or you switch on your TV, or you look on Facebook, there's always something relevant to the topic of leadership. So it makes it a really rich subject because there's all sorts of things you can bring in. I was a little disappointed when Donald Trump exited the White House because he was always full of great material, but there's plenty of others out there. So I'm going to look particularly today at this area of what happens when leadership goes wrong, because most of what you read about leadership, you can pick up any autobiography off the shelf where Bill Gates is talking about his leadership, or Oprah Winfrey talking about her creation of her creative arts business. Most of what's discussed about leadership is all the really good news stories about how things have worked out fantastically well, or how an entrepreneur has set up a business and it's gone global. So we hear all the time about success stories, which is great. But very often we tend not to associate leadership with what's termed the dark side or the negative side of leadership, because we tend to present leadership as more of this heroic, successful kind of construct. But there are other terms associated with leadership rather than heroic leadership. So one term is toxic leadership, another is destructive leadership, or unethical leadership. So these are three terms you will often hear linked to this side, the darker side of leadership, if you like. That's what I like to term it. So I'm going to talk about particularly toxic leadership with a theoretical perspective on that, and then we'll look at an example, and then do the same for destructive leadership. So we'll look at what that is in principle or in theory, and we'll apply it to a case study. But I'd just like to start off by kind of getting you to think about what destructive leadership might actually feel like, what it might be like. So if I hold up one of my props here, it's not very savoury. It's actually a rotten apple that I've been cultivating for quite a while. What happens when you put a rotten apple in a bowl with other fruit? What do you think happens? And what have you seen happen when you've got a rotten apple right in the centre of a really lush, delicious looking bowl of fruit? Well, it tends to affect everything else, doesn't it? One rotten apple in a bowl will, over the course of a day, a couple of days, impact on all the other fruit around it, and that will become rotten as well pretty quickly. And it's exactly the same with leadership. If you have somebody in an organization in a senior position who's responsible for other people, responsible for budgets, responsible for decision making, that's behaving in a toxic, destructive, or unethical way, other people start to be affected by that. So some people may become victims of that in the sense of experience bullying or harassment, whereas other people may think, well, okay, if the leader's behaving like that to other people, then I can do the same. What's to stop me from picking on people or getting my own way in every situation by being aggressive? So leadership behaviors become sort of self-fulfilling. And positive leadership behaviors tend to encourage positive behavior amongst those around them, but negative leadership behaviors have the reverse effect. So I've been talking then about this idea of toxic leadership or destructive leadership, but I mean, what are some of the behaviors that you would expect to see? Well, I'll go through the top 5 destructive leadership behaviors. I'd like to think about if you've experienced any of this. So some of you might have part-time jobs. Some of you have certainly been in, well, schools and college situations where you've experienced people in leadership roles. And, you know, outside, you might do volunteering and you might be in clubs and societies, sports clubs and societies. So there could be lots of occasions when you've experienced leadership. So I'd like you to think about, have you seen any of these kind of behaviours? So at number 5, it's a lack of trust. So a negative leadership, toxic leadership behavior would be not trusting other people, and in which case you tend to micromanage, you tend to over interfere and start to direct and control what other people do because you don't have any trust in how they're behaving. And obviously over time, that's going to demotivate people and make people feel very disengaged. At number 4, it's leaders who hire, promote the wrong people. So they could be motivated to promote friends or family, so engage in nepotism, just bring people in that they know they like, or recruit people that are just like them. So they're quite an aggressive, quite a directive, controlling sort of person. They tend to recruit the same people into the organisation, making the situation worse. So destructive leaders tend to try to influence those around them by selecting people that are going to support them and not challenge them, so hiring the wrong people. At number 3, it would be setting unfair working practices. So it could be requiring people to work very long hours, excessively long hours, sometimes not paying them for the hours that they work, or paying them very low wages for those hours. Giving people very risky contracts. So, only hiring people on the day when you need them and not paying them sick pay and all that kind of thing. So unfair working practices, which again makes people very vulnerable, employees very vulnerable and very dependent on the leader. And Deliveroo obviously have been in the news for this, and there's been a recent settlement around the terms and conditions of Deliveroo drivers around holiday pay and minimum pay and that kind of thing. At number 2, a destructive or toxic leader may actually steal from the organisation or take bribes or engage in corruptive behaviour or corruption. And there's lots of examples of this, unfortunately, in the news. A way back, you had Rupert Murdoch with the Mirror Group, who collapsed the Mirror Group because he was taking money out of the pension fund. And effectively, you had thousands of employees that overnight lost their entire pension because the money had been fraudulently used by Rupert Murdoch to kind of support his business and other businesses and his lifestyle. There was a very famous case of Enron not so long ago. Ken Lay and Jeffrey Skilling, and they embezzled $74 billion from the organisation. They overstated the financial performance of the business and kind of misrepresented the finances. And eventually it was discovered and the company went bankrupt, but at high cost to people that had shares in the organisation. And again, people use these shares as sort of long-term saving, lost all their money. And tens of thousands of employees lost their jobs and lost their pensions. So, the kind of destructive leadership behaviour, which is fraudulent, criminal, has major impacts on employees and other stakeholders in the organisation. But probably at number 1, the top destructive leadership behaviour would be physical or psychological abuse. So leaders who harass employees or physically abuse employees would be probably the worst example of destructive or toxic leadership. So there aren't any examples like that, are there? Surely. Well, unfortunately, as with everyday life, you get bullies in organisations too. Thankfully, they're not common, but they do exist. I mean, we only have to look at the Me Too movement to see that Harvey Weinstein was at the start of a massive campaign around sexual abuse and harassment in the film industry. And lots of people have come forward to say this happened to me too. Those would be the top 5 destructive leader behaviours. Well, there's a theory on destructive leadership, which is called the toxic triangle. And this was by Padilla in 2007, if you want to look it up. And effectively what they said, that the group of researchers said, well, there are 3 elements to destructive or toxic leadership. One is the leader themselves. So engaging in these kinds of behaviours, so nepotism, narcissism, self-love and feeling that they're the most important person in the room, exerting excessive power, or they have an ideology of distrust and hate of others, which just drives their behaviour. So destructive leadership is one element of this triangle. But according to them, it's not the only thing, because in order for a destructive leader to survive and to thrive, you need a conducive environment. So you need an organisation and other stakeholders around them that support them. So enable their behaviours by having no policies, no regulation, no checks and balances, no systems, so that the leader can run amok because there's no way of controlling what they do. So conducive environments are a key element. But you also then need what's termed susceptible followers. So some of you may have had leadership positions, others of you may have had situations where you've been following leaders. But in the toxic triangle model, followers are really critical, because you have sometimes conformers as followers who feel quite vulnerable. Maybe they really need the money, they need the job, so they're prepared to put up with situations which they shouldn't, because they are in a vulnerable position. They may have low self-esteem, and they may lack maturity or understanding. So they make themselves susceptible to these kinds of toxic leadership behaviours. But you also get colluders as followers. So these could be individuals that quite like this toxic leadership because they themselves are bullies, or they themselves are nepotistic, or they are egotists. So they quite enjoy this environment of bullying and harassment, and they go along with it and they emulate those behaviours, and they themselves have bad values. So according to the theory then, this toxic triangle involves, number one, the leader, but also the conducive environment, which supports it through lack of regulation or lack of policy. And at the other end of the triangle, you have the followers, who either conform and accept what the leader's doing, or they actually enjoy it and they collude with that leader's behaviour. So if we focus then just on the leader then, there's a model, and I hope this works. I've done a little flip chart to see if this works. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. This model by Emerson, 2007, has basically two dimensions: subordinate behaviours and organisational behaviours. So in this top corner here, we have constructive leadership. So this is when leadership is going really, really well, because the leader is both in favour of the subordinate, pro-subordinate, and also in favour of the organisation, pro-organisational. And that kind of leadership would be looking after the employees, treating them fairly, putting policies and practices in place which support them, at the same time as helping the organisation to grow, deliver its values, deliver good quality to the customer. So that's constructive leadership. On the other side of that coin, you have supportive disloyal leadership, which is pro-subordinate but anti-organisation. So how does that work then? How do you get a leader that likes their employees but doesn't really like the organisation? Well, this would whereby a leader would maybe work collaboratively with employees to defraud the company, maybe pay people for hours they haven't done, give people time off, with full pay. Or maybe not be too bothered about people producing very poor quality work, because they want to get on with their employees. They like all their employees, but they're really not interested at all in helping the organisation. You've also then at the bottom there got what's termed derailed leadership, which is anti-subordinate and anti-organisation. So what would that look like then? A leader that doesn't like the organisation but doesn't like the employees either. Well, that would look like somebody who basically steals from the company because they don't care if the company survives or not particularly, or they don't think they're going to be found out, but they don't care about the impact on the employees. So they're very egotistical, very self-centered, very self-focused. The only person they're interested in is themselves and doing well out of the situation. And if that means bullying people, harassing people, stealing money for the company, that's what they'll do. And the last box there is what's termed tyrannical leadership, which is pro-organisational. So a leader that acts in favour of the organisation, but is anti-subordinate. So they're working against the interests of the employees. So how would that work? Well, this would be a leader who is fully focused on delivering the organisation goals. So making money, maximising the organisation's achievements, the organisation to succeed and be a market leader. But that would come at the expense of forcing people to work long hours, bullying people to make sure that they comply, maybe humiliating people in order to sort of highlight poor performance. So they work against the interests of the employees, but they are working very much to try and make the organisation as successful as possible. So that's Ineson's model of destructive leadership, that the destructive leadership can either be derailed, tyrannical, or disloyal and supportive of employees, but disloyal to the organisation. Let's have a quick look then at a case study. I'm sure you probably think of case studies which might illustrate this, but let's have a look at Uber. So here are Uber's values. Customer obsessed. We celebrate differences. We do the right thing. We act like owners. We persevere. We make big, bold bets. So those are Uber's values. All sound good in a very entrepreneurial company. So an organization that's really about putting the customer first, doing everything they can to make an environment where people feel freedom and creativity to do things the right way to achieve success for the customer and for the business as a whole. But the New York Times did an expose in 2017, and their expose was based on undercover interviews where people anonymously gave information to try and sort of give the information but protect their jobs. They accessed emails, they accessed reports, they accessed company information. And in 2017, they produced an expose which showed that lots and lots of examples of destructive leadership behaviour. So an Uber manager groping a female co-worker, a director shouting a homophobic slur, and a manager threatening to beat an employee's head with a baseball bat. So, we go back to these values, they look great. But if we then think, actually, where does that fit on our model of destructive leadership? You've got all these fantastic values, so pro-organisational, which are designed to bring about maximum success for Uber and deliver high quality for the customer. But you've got a lot of anti-subordinate behaviour there. You've got a lot of bullying, harassment, a lot of intimidation going on in order to achieve these results. A kind of leadership that's run riot around the organisation with no checks. So you've probably got tyrannical leadership going on here, or did in that period of time. So this between 2009 and 2016, this is the sum total of Uber's lawsuits: $161.9 million paid out for cases including unfair employment practices, so low wages, class action on safety, so encouraging drivers to perhaps go too quickly to meet targets between pickups and drop-offs, data and privacy breaches, both of customers and employees, sexual assault case, and one unlawful death, which resulted in the payout of $161.9 million over the course of that 2009 and 2016. Now, I'm sure Uber's changed very much since that New York expose was done in 2017, but it's an illustration of what can go wrong when there's limited controls around the way that leadership behaves. And Uber was very much set up almost as a small business within a large corporation. So people were enabled to kind of be very entrepreneurial and sort of self-managing, self-directing, which can have consequences if there's no sort of system of regulation and control. So how can we avoid this awful situation then of destructive leadership? What could be put in place? Well, if we go back to our model of the toxic triangle and we look at destructive leadership and we look at conducive environments and we look at susceptible followers, let's take each one of those in turn and think about what we might do. So conducive environment. How could an organisation protect itself against the possibilities of leaders behaving in these destructive or unethical ways? Well, first of all, they could have clear communication systems. So people are aware of decisions made and how they're made, have protocols for decision making. So things like committees or project groups or steering groups set up to review decision making. So it isn't just one person making decisions. Maybe have codes of practice, ethical codes, value statements that people are held accountable to, that are very clearly kind of built into induction programs and training programs. Have clear training and practice as well. So make sure you have compulsory training in things like recruitment and selection, health and safety, diversity, employment practices. Make sure that line managers and people with responsibility for other people are fully trained in ethical behaviours. Maybe have performance review systems which apply to everybody across the organisation, from the chief executive right the way down. Everybody's subject to a performance review that's done by, another individual or even a panel to make sure that, behaviours are kept on track and they're aligned to organisational values. You could also have clear policies for things like what happens when things go wrong. So have a complaint system, have a whistleblowing system. So if somebody thinks something's going wrong and something unethical is happening, there is a process they can follow to report it so it doesn't go unnoticed. And then things like staff consultative committees or trade unions, make sure that you have employee involvement, engagement in organisational processes. So it's not just left to teams of directors or teams of managers to make decisions, but you've got that kind of democratic process across the business. Let's have a look at susceptible followers then, which is another part of that triangle, isn't it, which enables destructive leadership. So first of all, hire the right people. Make sure that you hire people that are willing to challenge ideas, people that are willing to put their ideas forward rather than just conforming to whatever the leader suggests. There's my dog in the background. She's just come to say hello. So train people in that culture of decision making and questioning, so that people feel empowered and have maturity and that ability to question what's going on in the organisation. Encourage and enable whistleblowing. So if somebody makes a complaint, don't then dismiss them or then intimidate them to try and get them to withdraw the complaint. Follow the complaint through and make sure that it's actioned, because that complaint could actually sit on top of a major issue within the organisation. So take complaints seriously. And then also at an individual level, be prepared to challenge yourself. So if you think somebody is behaving in a way which is bullying, intimidating, harassing, illegal, then challenge it and make sure that person is held account. So go through the processes that the organisation has. And then lastly, destructive leaders. How do we deal with them? So that's the last part of the triangle, if you like. Well, firstly, as an individual, self-regulate. Make sure that you are self-regulating. I mean, we all get angry, don't we? We get sort of short-tempered, and we have days when we feel a bit less patient than other days, but regulate your behaviour. You know, just think, if you start shouting at a co-worker or you start shouting at somebody who's an employee, what message does that send? That it's okay for them to do the same? Or are you creating stress and anxiety for that individual that may have long-term health repercussions? So self-regulate. You know, if you do feel you're going to break and you're going to get angry about something, take a breather, take a break, take yourself off, have a think about it. So self-regulate your own behavior. Trust other people. So be prepared to delegate, be prepared to ask other people's opinions, because, you know, your ideas may sound great, but actually there are other things you might think about and to improve them. So be prepared to trust other people, share your ideas with other people. So to get feedback and to listen to that feedback and act on it if you need to. So, you know, if you did give somebody a task to do, maybe go and check, you know, was that clear? Was I helpful? Do you need any more from me, any more support? So get some feedback so that you know where you stand and you know how they're feeling. Delegate. So one thing destructive leaders very often don't do is delegate. They don't trust other people, so they make all the decisions themselves, and they don't have full information. So it's important to delegate and to bring other people in to give their expertise. And I think most importantly of all, really respect other people, respect their human rights. So what right have you got to bully somebody else, to harass somebody, to shout at them, to treat them in a way that you would not be wanted to be treated yourself? So have respect for yourself and have respect for other people is a clear key way of avoiding destructive leader behaviours. So that's what I wanted to say. I wanted to talk to you about what destructive leadership is, sometimes termed toxic leadership, sometimes termed unethical leadership. We've talked through the model of the toxic triangle, where you've got destructive leadership, conducive environments, and you've also got susceptible followers as part of that triangle. So you need to pay attention to all of those elements, not just the leadership. We've talked about top 5 destructive leader behaviors. We've talked about an example, a theory of destructive leadership, Ineson's model, and the different elements of that. And we've used Uber as an example of tyrannical leadership at that period of time, as sort of investigated by the New York Post. And then we talked about ways that you might avoid falling into this toxic triangle of behaviors. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that it will interest you and also perhaps make you think about your own behaviour and be prepared to challenge the behaviours of others. Thanks very much.